Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Roth. I am director of the Ryerson Image Centre, and it is my privilege to welcome all of you tonight to the Scotiabank Photography Award lecture. Our speaker tonight is last year's winner of the SPA Award, Mark Ruwedel. This lecture accompanies our current exhibition across the street at the Ryerson Image Centre, which samples and surveys landscape work from throughout Mark's career. Before I introduce Mark, I would like to take a moment to thank some of the many people who help us in our mission, not only with this exhibition and lecture, but with the others that we put on and with the work that we do in our research center. I first want to thank Ryerson University's Provost and Vice President Academic, Mohammed Lachmi, and his team, along with President Sheldon Levy and the rest of the university administration, for their terrific support of photography here at Ryerson University, not only at the RIC, but also in the Faculty of Communications, Art and Design, headed by Dean Garrett Hauk, and the School of Image Arts, chaired by Alex Anderson. In everything that we do, we are supported by the Ryerson Image Center's Advisory Board, chaired by Florence Mins, and I want to express our great thanks to them. We are also indebted to our hardworking, enthusiastic, and brilliant staff, most of whom are here with us tonight. It is an honor to stand on their behalf and welcome you tonight. Every year, in the month of May, we're fortunate to present our exhibitions in the context of the Scotiabank Contact Photography Festival. I would like to extend our appreciation to the amazing crew of Contact who do so much every year to bring photography in all of its forms to life for Toronto audiences. Contact is led by Executive Director Darcy Colleen and Artistic Director Bonnie Rubenstein, and I thank them, their terrific board, and their remarkable staff. They do an amazing amount with very few people and very slim resources. All of our exhibitions this year are primary or featured exhibitions or public installations of the Contact Festival. And in addition to Scotiabank Photography Award 2014, Mark Ruwedel, these include, at the RIC, Scott Conorow, Canada by Rail and by Sea. We're very happy to have Scott with us tonight as well. Phil Solomon, Empire x8, and A Telling Portrait, the work and collection of Michael Mitchell. I hope you will have the opportunity to see all of these exhibitions at the RIC in the coming days. We are very happy that this year we were able to bring all of the artists to Toronto to speak about their work. In addition to Mark's lecture tonight, he will also be returning to Ryerson on May 20th to lead a gallery tour of his exhibition. And on June 3rd, Scott Conorow will lead a tour and discussion of his exhibition. On June 24th, Phil Solomon will be present here, traveling from Colorado, to speak about Empire x8. And on June 25th through 28th, he will be at the TIFF Cinematheque to introduce 3 screenings surveying his career as an experimental filmmaker. You can get information about Phil's appearance at TIFF on TIFF's website. And finally, we have one additional event I'd like to flag in conjunction with Contact. On Friday, May 22nd, here in this auditorium, artist Sally Mann will appear to read from her new autobiography, Hold Still, a memoir with photographs. Sally's lecture and books will be free of charge, courtesy of our generous friends at the Contact Festival. But we do not have enough books, I'm sad to say, for everybody in the audience. So if you are planning on coming, please plan to arrive early. We are distributing them free, but first come, first served. And finally, I would like to extend our deepest thanks to the sponsor of the Scotiabank Photography Award, and that, of course, is Scotiabank. Both for this exhibition and for the preceding ones and for the ones yet to come, in particular the 2015 Scotiabank Photography Award for 3 artists shortlisted who are anxiously awaiting whether or not they will hear their name called tomorrow night. Scotiabank has done a great service, I think, to Canadian photography by celebrating the work of a senior Canadian photographer and helping to bring their work to an international public through a book publication with Steidl and through the exhibition at the Ryerson Image Centre. They are not only creator and patron of the SPA Award, but Scotiabank also sponsors the Contact Festival, and we are very grateful for their support. Although many people at Scotiabank work on these projects, we are especially indebted to Jane Noakes, Director of Arts, Culture and Heritage, and Executive Director of the Scotiabank Photography Award. Jane co-created the award and co-administers it with Ed Bertinsky, who is also a member of our advisory board at the RIC. Joan Burgess, who I saw earlier tonight, I know she's with us, manages the complex and never-ending SPA endeavor and works very closely with her team. We are grateful to all of them and to the people that they work with at the bank for all that they're doing for Canadian photography. I would like to add a program note before we begin tonight's lecture. First, of course, please take a moment, if you haven't already, to mute your mobile phones to avoid interrupting the lecture. And also, after the talk tonight, Mark will open up the floor for Q&A, and we will be distributing microphones throughout the crowd. Please note, if you do want to ask a question, please wait for the microphone to come to you, and that is because we are live casting tonight's lecture on Rycast, and we want everybody who is listening from home to be able to hear your question clearly. If you would like to encourage any absent friends to follow along with the lecture, please feel free now to text them and let them know that we have posted a live stream to the lecture on our website, on our events page, and also through social media. If you'd like to listen to the talk again later, it will be archived with the Rycast lectures on our webpage. This year's Scotiabank Photography Award exhibition, which I co-organized with Gael Morel, exhibitions curator at the RIC, which is on view through June 28th, surveys 3 decades of Mark's work and includes photographs from his most important and celebrated series. Working primarily in the Western Territories of the United States and Canada, he documents traces and imprints of human activity, the visible evidence of our relationship to the land. Mark draws on disparate traditions in art to make his work, from 19th century expeditionary survey photography to earthworks artists such as Robert Smithson, to the social landscape imagery of the 1970s by new topographics photographers such as Louis Baltz and Robert Adams, and the humorous photoconceptualism and bookworks of Ed Ruscha. Many of the works included in our survey were made in desert regions and show abandoned homes, discarded objects, disused rail tracks and trestles, and the vestigial markings of overland routes and previous inhabitants. It was a privilege for Gael and I to work with Mark to realize this exhibition, and it is our honor to introduce him to you tonight to talk about his career. Mark Ruwedel was born in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania in 1954. He received an MFA in photography in 1983 from Concordia University in Montreal, and afterward he taught at Concordia through 2000. In 2002, Mark relocated to teach at California State University in Long Beach. He continues to teach there and presently divides his time between Long Beach and Refuge Cove, British Columbia. He is represented by several galleries in the US, Canada, and Europe, including Gallery Luisati in Santa Monica, California, and Art 45 in Montreal, Quebec. Mark's work has been exhibited internationally and is included in many major museum collections worldwide, including here in Canada, the Vancouver Art Gallery, the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, the National Gallery of Canada, among many others, and worldwide in places like the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, Tate Modern in London, England, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., which just last week included one of Mark's grids from Westward, the Course of Empire, in a new exhibition celebrating the last 25 years of collecting at the museum. He has won many major grants and awards. Just last year, he learned in 1 month that not only had he been awarded the Scotiabank Photography Award, he had also received a coveted Guggenheim Fellowship in Photography. We are very happy to have Mark here with us today. Please join me in welcoming Mark Ruwedel.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Paul. That was very nice to listen to. I also would like to thank a few people very briefly, just to before I start blabbing about my pictures. Certainly, Paul and Gail and everybody else at the Image Center. If you haven't seen the show yet, I personally think it's terrific. Plan on spending a lot of time with it, and of course the entire team at Scotiabank for the award. I'm really grateful to won that last year. And I'm just going to leave it at that for now. I have way too much stuff to show you and talk about, And if, with any luck, someone will just say that's enough and we'll go home. But I also have to say that at lunch, I don't have to say this, but I will. One topic of conversation turned out to be like really, really bad artist talks that we had suffered through over the years. So the pressure is really visceral, you know? And not having notes, I'm going to maybe talk someone out of sequence sometimes. I did want to also publicly thank Teresa Luisati and her assistant, Natasha Barakov, for getting all that work here. With that. And one other thing I want to say before, am I getting louder? Where's the, sorry, there we go. What was the other thing? I was going to give you a bit of a brief biographical sketch while I showed you a picture I made in undergraduate school. And when we transferred my PowerPoint to this computer, that one picture disappeared, and I don't know what that means. They said it was corrupted. You can take that how you will. But so what I'm gonna still tell you some of that stuff, but we're gonna look at something else. And the reason I chose the picture that you're not gonna see is that it's kind of weird and not very good. And I wanted to call, I thought maybe in terms of understanding the trajectory of my work and the evolution of my thinking in photography is that I didn't set out to be a photographer. The point of that missing picture was that having had to take a photo class as a painting student, I thought to be art, a photograph had to be kind of weird. And so that was the point of that. And you know, and I was quite naive. If we go back a step further back, I went to study painting in undergraduate school, and I chose painting because they didn't have drawing for underground comic books, which is what I really wanted to do when I was 19 years old or something and that. But in those 4 years of school, it was a really good time to be a student, I think, and especially a student that was in driving distance to New York City. In 4 years, I went from wanting to draw like Robert Crumb to wanting to paint like Mel Bachner. But along the way, I got introduced to photography, and photography was more interesting to me socially than aesthetically, in that all the interesting people in the school hung out in the dark rooms. And while I was, I'll tell this one anecdote, and then we will stop talking about my youth. But I was really interested in printmaking. The printmaking instructor, however, had taken EST, if you know what that is, the Human Potential Movement thing. And so if you don't know what that means, you will in a second. And we would start the class by standing in a circle, holding hands, and chanting, "We are all great artists." And so on the other side of that wall was the photo area. And while we were doing that, and I was embarrassed to death, I could hear Miles Davis blasting in that room over there, and I thought, that's where I want to go. And so I went over there, and I took both the photo class. Anyway, I gradually, after, I decided that painting wasn't for me for a couple reasons, one of which was photography promised some sort of engagement with the external world that I gradually fell in love with that idea. So a few years later, I went to Montreal to pursue an MFA, and in that 2 or 3 years, I guess I laid the groundwork for a kind of photography that's based on empirical observation without claiming to be a documentary. About 7 or 8 years ago, I talked in, I think, this very room. The title of the lecture was, "I Am Not a Documentary Photographer." I was interested in using the tropes of landscape photography and the kind of documentary photography that perhaps Walker Evans best exemplifies as kind of lyrical documentary, where in the hand of the artist is really subdued. That just was a really powerful and attractive idea for me. But also the idea that landscape, which I think a lot of young people, at least at that time, considered to be sort of like not the most interesting, cutting-edge place to be in the art world, partly because of the endless imitators of a kind of picture that goes back beyond Ansel Adams, but is perhaps best exemplified by his practice. And so landscape, you think of calendars of trees with snow on them. And, but the generation previous to mine had suggested their work, Robert Adams, Louis Balch, Joe Deal, their work suggested that landscape could be a place where one could speak about the social, about human values and relations, and et cetera, et cetera. So I gradually defined myself as being a landscape photographer. While I was still in school, however, I did this very small project on Walker Evans' photographs of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which he had done in late 1935. And that's, if you're not familiar with the work, the Evans picture's on the right, and my review of that same scene is on the left. And I did that partly because it was a way to interrogate a kind of photography I was interested in, but also there was this kind of personal connection because that was the town I grew up in. And the work of Evans represented a kind of pivotal point in my thinking about what could be a subject for a photograph that would be a kind of a statement, an art statement, as opposed to some, because the thing about photography that's both so fascinating and so frustrating, and more increasingly and into the present, is that photography is only sometimes art. It's lots of other things in our culture and that. And I think Evans has had a very sophisticated understanding of that dichotomy and did some really interesting things in relationship to that question. So we're going to move on. So this sort of sequence of pictures I'm going to show you more or less parallels both the Scotiabank Award book and the exhibition across the street, in that it begins in 1984 with a few. What I did is that to make a survey of 30 years of work, I chose only what I thought were the most relevant projects of the 80s, relevant in terms of what I had done since and the kind of artist that I think I became. I did lots of other things that we're not going to be subject to this evening or in the gallery. In '84, I moved temporarily to the Pacific Northwest, and I was really interested in the landscape of on the sides of Mount St. Helens. So I did this rather small project about the river that flows off Mount St. Helens. And of course, this is 4 years after the volcanic eruption. But I think what holds my attention in that work was the kind of ambiguity of the evidence that the pictures displayed. It wasn't really clear, because this was a landscape that was ravaged both by so-called natural and so-called humankind or human-made forces that work on it. A volcanic eruption, but also very intensive logging practices. Sort of working simultaneously on the same land. So that was maybe that ambiguity and those kinds of questions something that I think follows through a lot of the later work. The other project from the 80s that I thought was useful to think about in terms of recent material is a portfolio of the ruins of Expo 67, Terre des Hommes in Montreal, which had been pretty much just left to rot for a long time. So somebody once said that these pictures were kind of the bonsai version of the kind of concerns I have throughout all my work. It's kind of shrunken and twisted, but everything's there. So I was curious about that, and this recurring idea of the contemporary ruin begins here, perhaps. This idea of like a glorious future from the past that never happened is maybe another theme that runs through the work. At some point, I got really interested in, as Paul did mention, 19th century expeditionary photography. Originally, the photographs of war and that, and what I was most attracted to, or not attracted to, but curious about, is this something I can use, was the relationship of the caption on the mount. These are all photographs that were mounted on card, and it's the relationship of the caption and the landscape depicted. In the American Civil War, for example, the technology didn't allow like action shots of actual combat. The photographs were usually made the next day, sometimes in the case of this portfolio, a year after the event. So this kind of often banal landscape photograph becomes charged or implicated in some sort of technological or human or political drama by its relationship to the caption. The caption locates it in a moment in history. Without that saying battleground, or sort of Georgia, et cetera, one could, you can make any number of guesses as to why that landscape looked the way it did. It could have been combat, it could have been crazed beavers, you don't know. So the first work I did that sort of very self-consciously set out to kind of, work with that idea, can that be useful in any kind of with a contemporary subject? So I photographed along the Columbia River at Hanford, which is in eastern Washington state. It's where the United States, starting in World War II, built a succession of plutonium production reactors whose sole purpose was to make weapons-grade material. And I wanted to, again, this is very self-conscious, sort of quote and allude to this pictorial tradition, 19th century photograph by Timothy O'Sullivan. Those are my cohorts in this venture of floating down the river. At some point, we learned that although the land of Hanford was off limits to the civilians, the water wasn't. So we're only breaking the law there until we get our feet wet. Anyway, it was it was a way of thinking. I mean, it was obviously a really charged kind of subject, but I wanted to kind of treat it with a great distance, both an aesthetic distance and perhaps a historical distance. Because for me, regardless of my politics of say, nuclear weapons and mass destruction and all those big subjects, I was most interested in this subject as a way of sort of thinking about art historical precedents in picture making, as much as calling it, I mean, I didn't have to call attention that there were reactors along the Columbia. People know that already. I was interested in a kind of making a certain kind of picture and thinking about how those pictures work and so on. I don't know if you know that, I'm not sure how sharp things are in PowerPoint from a distance, but those little lumps there on the shore are actually deer. It's just a kind of interesting aside that I never saw as much wildlife as I did on the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, because nobody's hunted there since 1942. Of course, my colleague, having a more twisted imagination, brought up the whole legend of Dr. Moreau, and that perhaps they were first-generation reactor workers, not deer at all. When I started thinking about what those 19th century photographs could sort of give me, if you, it's one way of putting it, I wanted to play with putting the text on the mount, just as the Barnard photograph that I showed earlier. But so I just the only thing I had at hand to play with that idea was a pencil, but it became really attractive to me, and in fact I continued to do some variation of that with most of my work, to have some sort of text written on the mount to the photograph. What I liked about the pencil was that at a certain viewing distance it disappeared. So I'm just showing you a detail to show what a lot of this stuff actually looks like. And of course, it's, those letters are 1/8 of an inch high, and they're in like a 6H pencil. That to me somehow, though, was analogous to this idea of a casual glance versus a close reading. Like if one got up and started really looking, then whatever that text was giving you might inform how you interpreted the visual evidence in the picture. So the Hanford project became morphed into a slightly larger work about both the landscapes of both the Manhattan Project and the subsequent Cold War landscapes that engendered. And in 1995, it was probably the only time I worked towards a self-imposed deadline. I wanted to have a set of pictures completed in time to exhibit for the 50th anniversary of the two bombings. But 4 or 5 years later, thanks in part to Serge Weisman, who's here in the audience, and Stephen Bolger, who's not tonight, I was able to revisit this work as a sort of artist book, which the book form allowed for yet more use of text. And this project became, this is called the Italian Navigator. And that the reason it's called that is not that I'm against Italians, but I found all these really kind of great relationships and the history of these two different kind of incursions into the American West. The first one represented by the first European, let's call them visitors, and then 500 years later. So just a few of them. I mean, and I guess this is again sort of maybe underlining what I was trying to say at the beginning, that I find fact so wonderful, mysterious, and compelling that I'm, I just my work is always. That's why I'm so enamored of the descriptive mode of making photographs. I've never ever done fictional type things in studios. Not that I have anything against that, but that's not my interest. My interest is I find that like Rand McNally has more ready-made metaphors than I could ever come up with. So this is actually a really banal photograph, but it's of the world's first nuclear waste dump. It's where the residue of Enrico Fermi's experiment, which was under the squash court of the downtown University of Chicago. That happened in 1942. Of course, Columbus landed in 1492. When the success of Fermi's experiment briefly allowed for the scientists to understand that the uranium, the bomb was a done deal. This is the moment when theory becomes practical. And so somebody that evening called Washington, D.C., and I don't know the names of these people, but they said in an improvised coded message, Jim, you'll be happy to know that the Italian navigator has just landed in the New World. And whoever was answering the phone said, were the natives friendly? And so they sort of, played with this thing, which, again, alluding to this, 500 years of a very kind of adversarial relationship to these same Western lands that they were now in the process of blowing up. Weirdly, that dump where they buried the waste outside of Chicago is in a place called the Palos Forest Preserve, and I didn't even know that when I made this book. I just dutifully included that name, Palos Forest Preserve, but I later learned somewhere, random reading, that that's the name of the port from which Columbus set sail. So I'll show you a few. I mean, this is a plate from that book I referred to, which shows the more extensive use of text with some of the exhibition pictures. That's a picture entitled The Secret on the Hill. This is probably the only time I ever use sort of suggestive or metaphoric titles as opposed to just really, banal, like Wonder Valley number 43. And there's also a nice little photo history footnote to this picture. That's the setting for Los Alamos, which was where the secret city was that did all the theoretical work for the atomic bomb. It was only known as a place. It was only officially known as a post office box in another place. But that big building up there in the top left corner, after I made this photograph, I drove up there to get the name of it because I was really interested in these very fact-based descriptions that I would write on the boards. The photographs were carried on. That was EG&G Enterprises, which I just wrote it down in my notebook and moved on. The first E of EG&G stands for Edgerton, and that's the same Harold Edgerton, that kind of wacky scientist who shot bullets through oranges and stuff. He also had a sideline in nuclear weapons components. So it's something that's not in Newhall. This is another photograph from that series. It's missing its tail, but it's a little boy bomb casing that was used as target practice. It's still sitting out there because that's Air Force land that is off limits to the public. It's basically a little boy, but filled with concrete rather than fissionable material. Homage to Slim Pickens. The witnesses, these are the benches that the senators and generals sat to watch the bombs go off at Nevada through the years of atmospheric testing, which ended in, I can't remember if it's 61 or 63, began in 1952, where they more or less staged full-scale rehearsals of World War III. It's pretty banal looking. I mean, it's sort of, that also attracts me that, it could just as well be an abandoned Little League field until you realize where it is and who sat there and why. Okay, so in a kind of lecture like this, it's sort of, maybe, especially speaking retrospectively, it sort of sounds like I did that, did that, did that, did that. But in fact, I'm really kind of a messy worker, and I have all these simultaneous interests that are kind of cooking on different, if we use the stove metaphor, I have, pots on the back burner and pots on the front. And actually, previous to the work on the nuclear landscapes, I'd started photographing the remains of the earthwork sculptures in the 1960s. So partly because I was curious to see, like, what do they look like now? I guess for the same kind of reasoning that I wanted to go to Nevada to see where the generals sat to watch the bombs go off. What did it look like now? What's left? The Smithson Spiral Jetty, the first time I photographed it, was underwater, and somebody invariably asked where am I standing. I'm standing. I'm actually not standing, I'm sitting in a Cessna. But most aerial photographs don't have that much of a horizon-sky relationship, so it reads like a view from a distance. In any event, if you're not familiar with Smithson's work, this is the official one of the official pictures, of course, made just near the completion of the work. So I was interested, like, how do these things participate in the dynamics of the landscape? These are artworks, but they're artworks not preserved in museums. They're subject to the same forces that are working on that hill and that. So anyway, I developed this kind of long-term, not even a project, but just a kind of activity that I would go to these places every couple of years and look at them. That's 1 year later. Now, there was this other thing that led me to the nuclear subject, and that was, I was also interested in, like, how can you photograph stuff you can't see? And that was also part of the thinking with the work with the caption, which I neglected to say a few minutes back. So one of the reasons I was so interested in photographing Smithson Spiral Jetty was I realized that, or I had read that it was underwater. So oh, that's really cool, you can't see it. I'm gonna go there and photograph it. And again, to kind of see, like, how little like, how charged can I make that little bit of information? Can I implicate that pile of rocks in something that has a historical significance of some sort, whether it's artistic or nuclear weapons or what have you. Years later, and this is a piece that doesn't look so well here, it's in the exhibition, I revisited the Spiral Jetty yet again with the idea of doing a 360-degree panorama from the center of it, because it had once again emerged from the water, so one could walk out to the and if either its end or its beginning, I'm not sure. That's the great thing about a spiral. But and then I wanted to pair that with another 360 degree of a piece that Smithson didn't make. So this is called Built, Not Built. The top is what I just described. It's 360 degrees from the center of the Spiral Jetty. The bottom is 360 degrees from the center of this little tiny rock in the Pacific off Vancouver Island called Miami Islet, where he was going to do a piece just months before the Spiral Jetty called The Island of Broken Glass. The kibosh was put on that at the last minute. It sort of dovetails with a very nascent, radicalized environmental movement and a not insignificant anti-Americanism that was kind of at play during those glorious years of the Vietnam War. So it's a site of a piece that wasn't built, dreaming a piece that was built, if you will. Pause. I'll let you look at that. The problem with getting older and continuing to make work is, if you can't edit this stuff, it just becomes immense. Because I still want to talk about all these things, and then I never get to the recent work. So that's all, in a sense, the background to everything I've done since. And in the second half of the 1990s, I had 3 big pots on the stove. The first one started as this report on Lake Bonneville and became something even bigger called the Ice Age. And really briefly, that was, and this is partly informed by an interest in Smithson and his very interesting way of thinking about the dynamics of time and, geological time versus human time and that, and also his fascination with the concept of entropy, this kind of moving from order to chaos. Lake Bonneville is the largest of the Pleistocene lakes that characterize the arid American West. And this was a kind of a didactic piece I did to kind of think about like how can I look at landscape and see two different time periods, sort of, you know, when one's peeking through the other, you know. So the dark blue is, the larger dark blue blob is the Great Salt Lake in Utah, and the lighter blue is Lake Bonneville, which 17,000 years ago was that much bigger. And what's most interesting about that, there's two things that are really interesting about that to me. One is that the driest landscapes in North America their forms were caused by great bodies of fresh water that are no longer there. You know, so you stand in the West Desert of Utah and you look at the hillsides and you see successive beach lines. There's no water to be had. Those lakes, the end of that lake period more or less coincides with the entrance of human societies in the same landscape. So we see simultaneously with the kind of, you know, almost present in terms of geological time, forming of the land, and traces of the earliest peoples to live in those landscapes. So that's what that project became. And it has subsets of pictures that allude to more recent times, but like the idea of salt works, for example, which I thought just sounded wonderfully Old Testament. This actually is one of the few other pictures of mine that has a evocative title around it, and just a kind of place name indicator, and this is called A Line of Wreckage, which quotes yet another work by Robert Smithson. But I think as this project developed, certainly the center point of the thing, for me, the most significant pictures in terms of, I guess, of, you know, what I followed this with, were the photographs that depicted the material traces of cultures that lived on that land when that land was really different than it is now. If that's a kind of awkward way of saying it, that's an ancient footpath that goes from a spring that no longer has water to a lake that has no water. Okay, and because these are extremely arid landscapes, they're pretty much unmessed with. This stuff is sitting there, and I've talked to archaeologists about this stuff when I was making those pictures, and that trail could be 5,000 years old, it could be 10,000 years old. There's no way to date it. One could date sites along the way in that, but the desert archaic was a kind of culture that didn't evolve rapidly, and so these trails could have been used over thousands of years. Why are they still there? By contemporary Western standards, this land is pretty much useless. You can't run livestock on it. You can't grow things on it. So it's kind of left alone, except for, you know, there are occasional exceptions, one of which I'll show you in a second. This is a forked trail in the shadow of a mountain, one of the more subtle pictures in that. But I just love that idea of this trace. Really, you know, it's sort of mind-boggling to think maybe somebody walked here right down that line 6,000 or 7,000 years before I'm standing there with or without my camera, with or without one of my dogs. In this one, the trail runs across the picture, and it's bisected by tank tracks from World War II maneuvers when General Patton trained for the North African campaign in the very same deserts and that. So you have this kind of really great kind of layering of two different moments in time, two different cultures, and by implication, maybe two really different ways of thinking about the same hunk of dirt, you know. This is probably a dance circle or some sort of shamanistic drawing. Campsites. That's another. I think there's 3 of the campsites I'm going to show you. Or no, intaglios and rock alignments, as they're known, that are often of complex geometric patterns. That, although a lot of people seem to think this looks a bit like a bird, I don't know. And this one's kind of intriguing in terms of, like, in the way that, for me, the tank tracks are when they intersect an ancient footpath. And that little wedge of rocks is actually a fish trap. Okay, but where's, you know, of course, there's no more water. So that suggests a whole way of life based on an ecology that's gone. And it's, you know, at the same, and it's both a really long time ago, and in terms of those mountains, like it's like yesterday. So that's just stuff excites me, and then I make pictures. There's another set of pictures in the Ice Age project that are of caves that are, you know, these are documented caves in terms of human habitation. I didn't randomly choose them. they're all made, all the pictures are made from the position of somebody sort of in there, sort of hunkered down and looking out on the landscape. It's very subtle, but there's rock drawings on the left panel of this picture. And of course, that, and it's, you know, this kind of almost rocky drapery, and you see, that's tufa. That's actually solidified calcium carbonate, which means at one point that was underwater where I'm standing, you know, which is kind of mind-boggling. In some of these caves, this one and the previous one, and sometimes I mix them up, but I think this is the one. This is in western Nevada. They found 5,000-year-old duck decoys and fishing nets. So that suggests, you know, again, a suggestion of something that's not there anymore. In this one, they found 11,000-year-old sagebrush sandals. It's just kind of remarkable. So this was a picture from that earlier version of the Ice Age. And the reason I put it in at this point is to kind of, you know, think about, you know, like time as a kind of, you know, like a map is three-dimensional, and make like core samples into the past by looking at very particular landscapes. I wanted to include as much history as possible within the boundaries of these lakes. And so I went up here to photograph the first transcontinental railroad, which cut across the northern shore of that lake that wasn't there anymore. This picture sort of shows that terrain, and this is kind of interesting in itself. All that white stuff on the distant mountain is the Morton Thiokol rocket plant, which has lots of interesting historical relationships to the weapons industry and the military in general. In the foreground, though, we have two cuts made into the rock by the competing 19th century railroad companies, and they're sort of separated by a bird wildlife refuge, which is just weird. But this is where this happened. This is not my picture, of course, but this is a picture that, you know, maybe one of the first photographs to kind of celebrate, at least in the kind of North American idea of manifest destiny and Western expansion. This kind of, in other words, the triumph of technology over hostile terrain. That's what this picture is about. And that. So originally, as part of this Ice Age thing, I started photographing that railroad, but I quickly got so interested in this form that it became its own project. And this gradually becomes Westward, the Course of Empire. These are all railroad cuts. So this is like thinking of technology as a geological agent of change. They're all abandoned, of course. The rails aren't there anymore. They made me think both of 19th century landscape photographs, but also of 20th century sculptures like Michael Heiser's Double Negative in the just outside, more or less outside of Nevada, that completed in 1969. That's my wife, Corinne, standing up there on the horizon, so you know how big that hole is. Okay. So I started, and maybe more deliberately than some of the earlier work, I set out with, like, I'm just going to do that same picture over and over again. And as I started to research, like, where am I going to find these? Like, how can I possibly extend this? Like a lot of things I've done since, it quickly became, or over time became, the problem was like, how do I stop doing this? There's so much. But I thought that maybe one of the things I was thinking about is that if I use the same lens and stood in the same place, like if every picture was the same, but of course they're not, and every picture also depicted a different railroad line, because these pictures were coupled with the name of the railroad. So under one of them would say Central Pacific, another one it would say Vancouver, Victoria, and Eastern, and et cetera. And they're kind of poetic names often, Tonopah, Tidewater, Carson, and Colorado. That it would maybe somehow suggest the kind of scale of the enterprise of railroad building itself. So I very quickly developed this way of working with these pictures, which from a archive that I continuously added to, creating these kind of blocks of grids of pictures that would be sort of reestablished for the architecture of each exhibition opportunity. And then I was fortunate enough to make a book version of that. And I'm going to go through this quickly, but you know, after a couple of years of walking past stuff like this to photograph those dramatic cuts, I became really interested in this form, which was almost invisible. So this book actually, there's the first sequence in the book sort of gradually shows a gradual articulation of this form, which goes from like almost invisible to something that's clearly recognizable as a railroad grade, although in almost all cases there's very little indication that it was a railroad. That's just, you know, some very straight road. This one's kind of interesting because it goes right past that little boy bomb casing that I photographed for another project. So a lot of my stuff, sort of the terrain overlaps as well. And we'll just take a break from those boring black and white pictures for a second. This, my first and last, and I don't know why nobody's asked me to do anything again, but this was a billboard project I did for Los Angeles County Art Museum. And I was really fortunate that they didn't put their logo on the corner in that. So could you imagine if you just were sitting at the red light in your convertible Jaguar, you know, looking up and thinking, what the fuck is that? Anyway, okay. And I liked when those, again, this kind of alignment, this suggesting these different moments. Here's a 19th century railroad that leads straight to the deep space listening station. Okay, that's what those dishes are on the horizon. Okay. So we've already talked about these. I want to get to something more interesting. Then there's also, finally, the sort of third and fourth typologies of this work, or the tunnels, which I photographed the same way as everything else. They're kind of creepy, though, aren't they? A lot of the tunnels are in British Columbia, so they're kind of dense and dripping and dark, unlike most of the grades, which are in the desert states, the U.S. And then finally, the trestles, where that kind of camera position is finally broken, because you wouldn't see the trestle if you're standing on it with the camera. So now, towards the end of the long sequence of the book form of the project, I step back and look at these incredible engine. You know, there's something, if you know about Fitzcarraldo, that story, there's something Fitzcarraldian about some of these railroads, you know, because a lot of them were built for like really ridiculous short-term usage. You know, like a lot of them had to do with mines. They might have worked for 5 years and then the mine is depleted and they walk away, or and I don't know this history very well. I knew it better 10 years ago when I was working on this project, but the Kettle Valley Railroad in British Columbia had something to do with a deal to enter Confederation. And I don't remember the details in that, but there's a kind of political story to that that's completely invisible here and that. And and there's also some of these trestles. These are up in the Coquihalla Pass, if you know that part of the country. Some of them fell because the heavy snowfall over the years, but some of them were bombed as target practice by the Canadian Air Force. It's kind of, they might hit a random hiker, but there was nobody else down there, you know. Also another British Columbia photograph. And this is actually Eastern Washington. It has a kind of vaguely Egyptian feel to it to me. This is in the little town where they have the annual Combine Demolition Derby, a must-see. So if I'm just, I'm talking about these projects as if they're all completed, but in fact, like that, there's 72 pictures in that book, and that only represents 500 or 600 photographs that I made. So there's a kind of archive aspect to this work that like for example, rather than trying to explain that, I'll just show you. This is a piece I made just 2 years ago from that vast pile of negatives that I'd shot for the Westward Project. And so the book version isn't like the project, it's like an iteration of it. It's a work unto itself rather than a kind of monograph about something. So I made this group of 12, just shorthand and call them the forest grades. These same idea, the abandoned railroad grade, but in this case running through various types of forest. And then, of course, most of them having some relationship to the logging industry as opposed to, say, mining that a lot of the other railroads did. And then I was gonna, this is such a bad joke, I'm gonna tell you with quotation marks. Then I went to hell, okay? This is actually a place in California called Hell. Hell is the third pot on the stove that, if we go back to my stove metaphor a second, while I was doing all that other work, I started noticing that a lot of these places were named hell this and devil that, and through that developed this, both a kind of, begun in the railroad project and the research involved in that, but a great interest in place names as yet another kind of social imprint on landscapes. One, of course, invisible, but nonetheless very real. When one group of people takes over a land, the first thing they do is redraw the map and rename all the places. And so, so pictures of hell, as this becomes a project, is a kind of encyclopedic inventory of places in the American and Canadian West. Bob Bean's here, so I'll say that I did photograph several hell sites in Nova Scotia when I was teaching at NASCAD one summer, but I finally, just to make it somewhat manageable, I jettisoned all the eastern photographs of that project. And for me, hell begins somewhere in Colorado or Manitoba. Okay. This is actually a place called Hell. And it was called, I always thought it had something to do with the Army, but it turns out, at least if Wikipedia is correct, that it was a gas station, motel, restaurant thing set up along a very desolate stretch of road because there was nothing else there. When they built the interstate highway, they refused to give this guy an exit ramp. And so it just gradually disappeared. But apparently in the 50s, about 30 miles up is another place called Desert Center, which still stands, but they don't have a gas station anymore either. But that guy apparently used to have a sign that said, if you don't like our prices, you can go to hell. This is Devil's Canyon. And the thing that became really fascinating to me in this project was how these names repeat over and over again. So I currently have a show of pictures of hell up in Lusardi Gallery in Santa Monica. I have a grid of 21 gates, the gates of hell, Devil's Gates and Hell's Gates, that are all 21 different places. So, so the rule of this project was there would only be one picture per location or per place name. But within that, I had it was a kind of improv. So in some sense, it's similar. In other ways, it's different than the westward thing. The westward thing, I had this preconceived picture that I would go out and sort of perform. In Hell, or in the project Hell, I had to deal with whatever was there, and it varied considerably. And just another footnote, that line running through the more or less the second third of the picture towards the horizon is one of the railroads I photographed. That's the Hell's Gate on the Fraser. And you can see how, unlike the railroad pictures, these are, pictorially they're really different because the places are really different. I just ganged some of these to give, like these are both these places have the same name, they're Devil's Gate. Both those places are named Devil's Gate. I'll next entertain you with 4 different Devil's Punch Bowls, and then we'll move on. And this last picture, and it's not one of my favorites, but I put it in so I can tell you this little story. This is El Camino Del Diablo. It runs along the U.S.-Mexican border, and it was called the Highway of the Dead, or the road, because it was a shortcut used for a lot of prospectors and other fortune hunters going to California, and they didn't do so well along there. Apparently, the 19th century, this road was paved with graves. It's now within simultaneously the Cabeza Prieta National Wildlife Refuge and the Barry M. Goldwater Memorial Bombing Range. And to enter that, you need a written permission to enter that place. And Crane and I went together, and the forms we had to sign included the proviso that we would absolve the United States government of any responsibility should we be hit on the head from objects falling from the sky. More or less a direct quote. So that's why I wanted to show you that picture. Now, okay, so if we go back to the Ice Age for a second, this is a photograph of a desert intaglio of a horse, and it's very hard to see initially, but once you see it, I hope it just pops out. It's a horse drawn on the ground by removing rocks. So that's what an intaglio drawing is in the desert, and the head curls towards where I'm sitting, and the legs are splayed out towards you. I don't know if you can see it. And actually, 2 years earlier, I had made a much more descriptive version of this same site, but I preferred this one where it was almost invisible, and it just seemed to be more in keeping with what I thought I was doing out there with these pictures. But the reason I've put it here in the sequence was in hiking to this site, I started seeing, it's not unusual to see trash in the desert, and that's one of the things I really like about the desert is nobody cleans up, and so you can, you know, from pre-Columbian cultures to crazed weekend warriors, everything's out there to look at and kind of sort through and think about who was there before and what they were doing. This garbage was very particular. It consisted mostly of water bottles and inner tubes. And after a while, I realized, oh, duh, this, you know, I'm 100 feet from the All-American Canal, which is the border between the United States and Mexico. People are using inner tubes to float into the United States if they can't swim, and they're obviously carrying water because they're walking through a desert. So this was trash that had a really, to me, really significant political dimension. And there was occasionally much more telling details, like that red thing is like one of the, I don't know what they're called, one of those baby carrying things, you know what I mean? There's also a toothbrush in that picture and stuff. Yet more telling, Guatemalan passport. This became a project called Crossing. A lot of them are these kind of little, you can just imagine these little kind of hiding places where perhaps a group of people sat until dark or until their contact showed up. You know, again, like a lot of this stuff, it's hard to, one can only speculate. But from my encounters with Border Patrol in that area, of which I've had many, it's very clear as to who's responsible for this particular stuff. They just think it's a nuisance to clean up. I find it endlessly fascinating because it's sort of, it's like really, really little details to talk about or point to like really, really big ideas and phenomenon. And I think as my work moves on from that point, you know, like the railroad is about like a really big thing, and it's kind of big, those trestles, you know. But I think I get more and more interested in these little things and how can they still speak about big ideas, you know, like social migration, alienation, the collapse of Western civilization. Why not? Starting in maybe 2002, 2003, I started working in the deserts regions that are much closer to my current home, this kind of arc of unincorporated communities and desert, isolated desert houses and so on that surround the metropolitan area of Los Angeles. And I don't know if how clear these things are, but that says Alpha Omega and Alpha spelled wrong, and that sort of, in a way, sums up my whole thinking about this work. But I'm just fascinated by the endless variety of these houses. I'm also fascinated by the kind of sort of well, you can look at them humorously, or you can think about them in terms of tragedy and disaster, all the big themes. You know, why did they build them there? Why did they walk away? Did they walk away? Are they dead inside? Are they looking at me with a gun through a curtain? Any number of things. They're mysteries in that. So, I guess that's a kind of shift in the work in general, is I was much more clear about why I was doing those other projects I just showed than why I'm doing this. This is more about, these are more questions for me. These are riddles, and they're, and you know, I could talk about making them and stuff, but I'm less, I think I don't have a kind of bulletproof sort of, you know, airtight rationale as to what this work's about. I think there's like certain times I look at it and I think it's really about the architecture, these sort of handmade versions of very, by now, iconic California modernist designs for single-dwelling homes, single-family homes. I'm interested in the kind of Platonic house, you know. That's like the idea of a house. If you drew a house when you were 6, maybe it looked like that. And there's another one through the window, you know. But a lot of the houses are, you know, they look like they've been gutted. That, you know, for whatever reason, the people left, and they often left their stuff behind, and then somebody else came, and because there were no lights, this is my guess, because there's no lights on, they pulled everything outside to sift through it, so they're sort of surrounded by piles of all kinds of stuff. It's weird. The second time I went to this house, that piece of board on the left, to the left of the dirt pile there, turned out to be not just a scrap of wood, but a trapdoor to an underground bunker, and then this kind of stuff might also have something to do with the fact that I have an uneasy relationship to where I grew up, which was a suburban subdivision. I don't like lawns. I don't like split-level houses. Actually, in the essay that Grant Arnold wrote for the Scotiabank Award book, he speaks this one in particular as a house that's lost its lawn. Okay. So I'll just show you a few of these, and I don't know how we're doing with time, but a few more things. I don't know if anybody knows Dan Graham's work, but this makes me think of that piece he proposed, where the front wall of a suburban house would be removed and replaced with glass, or two-way glass, so you could stand outside and watch their lives at night. This one's just significant because there's almost no two-story houses in the desert. And I like to imagine a whole gang of meth-crazed bikers looking at me. But you know, see, that's what I like about these pictures, because the people I've met while traveling in these areas, some of them are like that. A lot of them are just people on a budget or people that like solitude. It runs the full range. But what they share is that kind of, they partake of that myth of sort of being on the edge of the frontier, and that and some, you know, people interpret that as to being beyond the law. So there is that, and there's an element of menace there, and I think some of the more gruesomely eviscerated house relics sort of suggests, you know, like some horrible crime occurred, but you know, not necessarily. So I like that element of suggestion. Where I carried over from the earlier projects as well as this kind of idea of like amassing pictures, so that, you know, that kind of similarities and differences become part of the work. There's maybe this idea of, instead of trying to sum up something in one picture, to kind of surround an idea or something with a certain number of pictures that might have some, you know, like in the way that if you repeat something in the laboratory, it becomes verified, you know, through repetition. A result that only occurs once is not verifiable. So I think about that kind of. So you know, I spent a lot of time talking about the 90s because you know, I have that down. But most of my work from, say, 2002 to 2003, the desert house is what we just looked at, as sort of like the sun of that solar system, and then there's all these planets that surround. The largest planet is called Dusk, and that's a series of the same, not literally the same houses, I mean, although sometimes that happens, but the same idea, but photographed after the sun has disappeared below the horizon, so there's no shadows, and there's kind of this weird glow to them, which doesn't reproduce well, so another reason to go see the show. But you know, there's very little moisture in the air there, so edges are really sharp. The sun goes down. For me, these things just sort of stand up and glow for a while, and then again, maybe they heighten what I'm interested. One aspect of the houses in general, the house pictures in general, and that is they're both really beautiful and somewhat disturbing, at least to me. And I like that kind of that frisson, you know, that vibration that occurs. Some of them are really dark. And then you get this kind of, you know, I'm still picking, you know, all this stuff I'm telling you, I'm also thinking about what pictures look like, and, you know, like that little magic window there just, you know, warms my heart, you know, visually. It's just a piece of tinfoil that's, you know, caught a little bit of light. They vary although the sun is literally not visible when I make the picture, the quality of light and the relationship of the differences between, say, the tone of the sky and the tone of the ground depends a lot in terms of where the sun was. So if I'm looking east or west, to make it easier to follow what I'm trying to say, there's a considerable. So that's looking. So the sun was behind me. So there's just that little bit. It's brighter behind me even, and so that tin foil is caught. That aluminum foil in the window has just caught a little bit of that brightness. You know, I hope that makes sense. If you could examine the print carefully, you'd see there's this wonderful pair of bullet holes right next to those two that mimic those two windows. There's two little windows, two little bullet holes. And then, you know, maybe I'll just show you a few more things, because they're other subsets. These are called neighbors, and they're literally two different structures very close to each other. I didn't like flop negatives or anything like that. They're kind of odd. And I'm just because why doesn't he? Somebody saying, why doesn't he make pictures in color? So there is this, another subset of this. I don't really know. I'll tell you what I'm calling it in my mind. The big umbrella title for everything, starting with the houses to now, at least what we're seeing, is called Message from the Exterior, and that plays on a late book by Walker Evans called Message from the Interior. So this group of pictures is called Shelter, just for lack of something more evocative at present. A slightly more temporary idea of shelter than some of the houses. Actually, the year before I made this picture, I went to the same place, and there was 3 mattresses like laying flat in a row, and I photographed that, and then I came by again, and I thought, Jesus, that's really interesting. And this one, of course, which I think says a lot. I think about my interest in the kind of past, the kind of ruins of the past idea of the future, if that makes any sense. That kind of, utopias that never came. Just this past winter, I photographed the house that Aldous Huxley lived in during World War II in the Antelope Valley, which is where a lot of these desert house pictures were made. And he had a studio there, and he would look out on the ruins of a socialist utopia that had collapsed in 1918. And in fact, he wrote an essay about the failures of utopias while sitting there looking at the ruins. And I'd photographed those ruins years ago, and just had access to photographing the house from which he made those observations. And that essay is called Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, which I believe comes from Macbeth. Anyway, that's what this picture's about, all that stuff. It's not 100% certain, but I do believe that's a real or a good copy of a Marcel Brauer chair to the left of the dome, which is just even more weird. And then we'll end with some stuff that's maybe a little lighter, some abandoned dog houses. I guess that depends on your relationship to dogs as to whether this is lighter or yet more bad news. The one on the right is the former home of Killer. And the one on the left, I think, again, like that White House, that's the platonic ideal of a doghouse. Do I have a few more minutes? Can I just do this? I'm going to skip this one. Just because I wanted to, I usually talk so long I never get to the end. And I wanted to get to the end so I could sort of come back to that first picture I showed. Then this piece is in the exhibition, although its companion one is not. Before I went to grad school, 2 things. One is, and I don't know how this happened, but I developed a really great interest in the phenomenon of artist books, especially the kind of really modest little cheap books by Solowit, Lawrence Weiner, Ed Ruscha, and it was a moment that and then those things are still around, that artists make books and we argue about what artist books are and aren't, et cetera, et cetera. But there was something really attractive about that idea that was also had a utopian tinge to it. The artwork, there was no original, so they were all the artwork, and they were $3, so all this kind of thinking. But I was just interested in the ideas and the various relationships of image and text and all this stuff, and the kind of humor. When I went to graduate school thinking, not knowing diddly about that kind of institution, I thought one had to do a thesis, in an art historical sense, even though it was a studio program. And I went to graduate school with this idea that I would do a thesis about artist books. And it turned out that I didn't have to do that, and so I didn't do the research and that, but I never lost interest in it. And my favorite books were the little books of photographs of Los Angeles by Edward Ruscha. And so that was like 1979 or something. So 2007, I've been driving around Los Angeles for like 5 years now, and I keep thinking about that, and I keep seeing stuff that reminds me of Ruscha's work. And of course, Ruscha is like this kind of semi-godlike figure in the LA art world. And so in '07, after 5 years of kind of thinking, I should do something. How can I? What? I come home from this from Refuge Cove after a couple months away, and some retiring professor that I barely even knew left this box in my mailbox, my faculty mailbox. It was a brand new, I mean from the '60s, but brand new, never used Yashica Mat 124D. And I knew by that point that was the exact same camera that Ed Ruscha had used to make all those pictures. And that was like a message from the God of art that I should go out and do this work. So since then I've made several pieces because they're sort of each, and this isn't like a collection. Those 15 pictures are the work in total of looking in a way similar, although hopefully more sophisticated than 30-some years ago, that I used the Evans pictures as using somebody else's work to both as a map for a real place and a way of thinking about picture-making problems, specifically photographic picture-making problems. And that this piece is called. There's the big Algiers here. That's just a detail. They're all really little pictures. Somebody saw this piece recently, said very old school. And I don't know if it's because they were analog prints or small or square or all the above, but it was definitely very old school. So what I did with the title of the piece is We All Loved Ruscha, 15 Apartments. And I, like 26 gasoline stations to him, that title almost came to me before I made some of the pictures. But I wanted it to be in past tense to introduce a slight note of melancholy to the work, because I think that's an aspect of an artist's relationship to what, as you mature, you start to think like you'll never be as good as the previous generation that you admired, and so there's something about that in there, and there's also something humorous. And like the Evans project, there was also this interest in the syntax of making photographs, so the equipment that one uses to make a photograph. So Ruscha's books, if you're not familiar, this book that I'm alluding to is called Some Los Angeles Apartments, and it's a picture, really deadpan square, small picture of an apartment building like these, with an address. And so I didn't take the book with me, I just took the addresses. And I was kind of surprised how some of them were really different, but some of them were dead ringers, as if I couldn't have gotten closer to the original if I had the book in front of me and kind of lined it up. And that had a lot to do with the fact that I was using the same camera, and that's a really rigid camera for making pictures, and the street is only so wide, et cetera. So that kind of stuff was also of interest to me. But it was a way of also, I wanted to photograph Los Angeles, and it was a way for me to begin by using somebody else's work, that's just the way it looks in installation. And the next one is the other completed, what I call Ruschesque pieces, is based on his book Real Estate Opportunities, which in the two pieces on the left of the slide, there are two double-page spreads from his book. They're photographs of vacant lots that were for sale, and they also had addresses. So I went to photograph them, and of course, some of them, weirdly, some of them look the same, but most of them, of course, look radically different, and that's why I chose this one. My picture on the right is the top right of the, which, in his picture almost looks like it's way on the edge of undeveloped town, but in fact, it's right in the center of Los Angeles, where the convention center is right now. That's the entire piece. There's 25 of them, which made for a really difficult kind of orchestration. But, and of course, you can't see them all, but that's what it looks like, and that's a good place to end, because that sort of makes sense with where I started, at least to me. So thank you for your patience. Thank you. You're going to orchestrate the questions?
Yeah.
Okay, so if there are any questions, Gail yeah?
Mark, this is a really big question because your work raises so many significant ones, and I want to start with a recent piece in the New Yorker that Peter Sheldall wrote about the show at MoMA, where he basically says, picking up on that Hopman show, that because of the atemporality and because all images are available to us now, at the same time, that there's no such thing as originality. It's lovely the way you framed your talk, because you start with Evans and, in a sense, end up with Evans. And Rouchet and all kinds of other people, and Dan Graham, and you don't mention the Beckers, but clearly you're invested in the way pictures have been made before. The big question that interests me a lot is, do you think it's possible, and this is not a criticism of your work, but in fact an affirmation of its quality, is it possible to be original in photography, and what would that direction, what direction would that take you in if it were?
Oh, well, that's two questions. Is it possible to be original, or is it possible for me to be original? And I don't, you know, personally, as the kind of author of this stuff, I don't really worry about that question anymore. You know, I'm more interested in just, in a way, following my nose. You know, but of course my nose is kind of infected by all this art history that I carry with me. You know, I've never tried to do something to be original, and I've never stopped myself from doing something because I thought maybe somebody else had already done it. So that's how I deal with that, more or less by ignoring the question. But is it possible to still be in? I hope so. Is it possible for somebody to chart new territory in photography? I mean, that's another way. Is that what you're asking? Yeah, maybe.
I guess the larger question is, does originality matter? And that is a separate question. So, and you seem to answer that in a way it doesn't matter to you, because following your own nose is a rather romantic conception, and there is a kind of romance in your work which is deeply embedded in everything you do, and I appreciate that as well. So, but that doesn't answer the question about how you make pictures and how conscious you are of what you would call the syntax of picture making.
Yeah. Okay. You know, I think what one of the things I tried to do in this talk was suggest a kind of, without being over, suggest a kind of process, in that, you know, I didn't like sit at home and do some reading and think, the railroad, you know, but rather I was out there doing something else. The railroad's there, or the trash along the border, you know. So I'm sort of putting myself in a place to respond to things. How I respond to that then is both whoever I am, but all that stuff I'm bringing with me. And so you could probably, and I'm not going to do it publicly, but one could point to different projects and say, oh, that's informed by such and such a kind of, and maybe not even an artist, but, you know, but a kind of, an approach or a kind of work. I think partly because somebody resurrected that show and toured that around not too long ago. The whole new topographics thing was a big topic of conversation a few years ago. And certainly some of what I've done, I mean, that work, represented by that rather troublesome title, represents maybe the first kind of contemporary landscape photography that suggested to me that that's a kind of neat place to work in. You know, that's an arena that's really fascinating. That's not Ansel. You know, it's Robert Adams, not Ansel Adams. That's what I thought. You know? And what's the point of that? But anyway, so, yeah, that's, I mean, what I meant by that is like that kind of approach that the word new, or the phrase new topographics is shorthand for, is probably more important, at least in my way of thinking, to what I built on than, say, the work of any one of those people that might be lumped under that umbrella. All of whom are both original and just like tweaking a tradition that's already there at the same time. And maybe that's sort of, you know, Rouchet is, I'm much more fascinated by his photographic works than his paintings. Which is kind of weird, because in a sense they're anti-photographic photographs, and one should, as a photographer, I should take exception to that. But I think they're a lot more radical because they play with that edge of, they're not amateur photographs, they're like amateurish photographs made by a sophisticated photographer, and that to me is so. And again, you know, see, the problem with your question is just makes me think about all kinds of stuff, and I'm not linking them up together very well, I'm afraid. But Yeah, I mean, even the kind of artists that we've seen in recent decades that are sort of applauded for being very original, they are, but, you know, Jeff Wall, for example, you know, all his picture-making conceits and his subjects and his approach to material, all that has connections with what came before. So one adds to something, but to kind of make this clean break like, I don't know, like Braque and Picasso did, I don't know. I don't think so. Too much has gone over the dam since then, you know? Well, give me an easier question. Like, what kind of film do you use? You know? I think, I'm not making, I really like that question. I just don't know how to resolve it yet, okay? Okay, give me another hard one. Oh, all right. What kind of film do you use? Kodak Tri-X. Nobody asked me about the whole analog digital thing. Is that like no longer a discussion? Are we past that? You know, I'm good. It's kind of, I mean,
Mark, I think there were questions about the color in the black and white.
Oh, yeah.
Like, why do you switch to color?
Well, most photographs are in color now, right? You know, both vernacular and commercial and artistic, and, you know. Black and white seems to, you know, let me try it again.
It's supposed to be easy.
No, it's, yeah, it was supposed to be easy. I just, you know, the first way of answering that is imagine some of what I just showed you in color. Imagine like 12 of those railroad cuts where it's 12 different blues in that V. It would just be so annoying, and so one would be so aware of how each blue is different, you know? And I think color, I mean, this is a really easy way of talking about the difference, and hundreds of photographers and artists that I've read interviews with have said the same thing. It has to do with structure versus surface, you know? And also I think, although, you know, digital color printmaking has changed a lot of these questions, and I'm not against color, you know, I don't have, what do they call that, chromophobia? Chromophobia. Not quite a long time ago, and maybe you wouldn't say it now, but Wim Wenders, the filmmaker, said, color promises to give us reality, but because color photographs, but because it doesn't, we're much more aware of the difference. Black and white, that's never a question to begin with, you know? So you say, oh, is it, you look at a color photograph and say, are those flowers really that red, you know? If it's a black and white photograph, you never say, are those photographs really gray? You know, it's just not a question, you know what I mean? So you can ask other questions, you know? And when I do like, and to be honest, I sometimes like, see the shelter pictures are kind of interesting because it's not, some of them are actually black and white pictures, some are color. The crossing are all in color. Partly, I think it was the color, the palette, my color palette anyway, allowed that stuff to kind of be more readable, like the passport, it's blue on the ground, you know, without kind of overdoing it. But so there was that. So it was like maybe the informative value in color was interesting to me for that project. You know, the doghouses, the first couple, it had to do with the time of day and the quality of light, and then I just thought, you know what, I'll just do them all in color so I don't have to figure that out later, you know? I mean, it's just that simple. They kind of create a coherency in there. But sometimes when I look at too many of those doghouse pictures at once, I kind of get annoyed by all the different blues, you know? You know, in LA, I'm sometimes envious of like German photographers who get to photograph in this wonderful overcast light for so many months of the year. And every time, you know, even if it's gray in the morning, by the time you get in the car and get out, it's burned off and it's blue, you know? On the other hand, unlike Montreal, I can photograph 365 days a year.
Thank you for your lecture.
You're welcome.
In your body of works, you are very embedded with American landscapes and history. You have shown a Nevada test site and more recent history about the cross-border migration. Then you show on your BC slides about the tunnel across the Rockies, and then also a historical shot not taken by you is when the Americans celebrate the breakthrough, the completion of the railway, the manifest destiny.
Yeah.
But actually, we do know that the photos do show something, but it also doesn't show a number of things, the history embedded, the social history. Because the Canadian Pacific Railway, they use indentured labor, and many people died in blasting those tunnels, those dynamites.
Yeah.
And also in that, both in the American shot and the Canadian shot, when they celebrate the last height, completion of the railway, they actually don't allow the foreign workers to be on site, so we don't see non-white faces. I wonder
No,
what you
in
have to
the
say on
American one, we don't even see Mormon faces.
that. Mormon,
Wow.
yeah, very unfortunate, yeah. Yeah, I wonder if you can add on.
But I don't know if that's a question or just an observation.
It's about the pictures we take. It shows certain things, but it doesn't.
Yeah, okay.
It hides certain things, yeah.
The U.S. one he's talking about, it's 1869, the so-called Golden State picture. That's maybe the first sort of photo op picture, because apparently the first time they did that, everybody was so drunk it was a dismal failure, and they sort of reenacted it for Russell, you know, and he wasn't the only photographer either. Just it was, you know, kind of gang of, just like one would have now, although with slower cameras and that. And you're right. Both the Canadian and American transcontinental railroads exploited non-white workers to a great extent, especially in the West, British Columbia, California, Sierra Nevada, and they're pretty much erased from at least they're erased from the visual history, yeah, for sure. Yeah. So yet another thing that photographs, of course, leave out things as well as put things in, you know. Sorry.
One last question.
Yeah.
You don't photograph in the East, I think, from what you said. Is that because there isn't enough emptiness there? And I mean, emptiness seems to be a really strong part of the kind of underlying emotional tonality of what you're doing.
Yeah. Well, of course, I used to photograph the East, and you know, the Walker Evans pictures, in Pennsylvania, et cetera, the Montreal pictures. But in the 80s, I did both. I photographed in the East during the academic year, and in the West, other parts of the year. The stuff I was doing in the West got so interesting and so consuming that I stopped the East. One of the reasons it was more interesting was that emptiness, but in fact, it's a very full emptiness. You know, I was speaking about the trash and that, and I mean that in a really broad sense. You know, not everything that's left there, not just candy wrappers, but petroglyphs. You know, whatever. But and also, I just think, you know, and I don't know how much of this is nature and how much nurture, but I have a minimalist aesthetic that you know, that I inherited. My certainly my artistic forebears, you know, I don't know where it all comes from, but you know, give me a razor sharp mountain with no fuzzy stuff on it any day, you know. And so I respond, and I think I started doing that when I was a kid. My family drove across the states a couple times, and God, when we got to Utah or South Dakota, I was just, you know, just like, and you know, I internalized that somehow. Several years later, and I started like drawing. At some point, I realized that I wasn't inventing these mountains. These are the mountains I saw in South Dakota and Utah when I was on that trips, like when I was 8 years old. You know, so that just when I drew mountains in however naive a manner, I never drew like the Appalachians or the Laurentians. It was always the Rocky Mountains or some ridge in Nevada or Utah or something. So there's something about just an aesthetic thing that responds to that clean, sharp expanse, you know.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mark, for this lecture.
Ça fait plaisir.
Please come and join us on Thursday night. We're having our public opening, and Mark is going to be there. Thank you very much. Have a great night,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Bye.
Mm.